3, 2, 1.
Hola, buenas tardes y bienvenidos a...
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on livestock production in the United States and Spain to efficient and sustainable model. We live in a world where international commerce is the norm. We're going to be talking about two regions, the European Union, Spain, of course, and the United States, where the food safety of the population is at the core of the political agenda at all times. And also in terms of the environment, we're going to be talking about two geographical areas that are separated by the ocean but joined by cultural ties. And these two areas are destined to work together because it is crucial to know each other well before starting. And that's what we're here for today, to get to know each other, to talk about the production models in each of our countries, to discuss possible synergies and to overcome any questions and queries. To do so, we have two women with us who are very familiar with the situation in the United States and in Spain. We have Carisha Kuipers, who is the attaché for the United States for agricultural aspects in Madrid. And we also have Esperanza Orellana, who is the Director General of the Ministry of Agricultural Affairs in the Spanish Ministry. So thank you both for joining us today. And I hope that, as I was saying, there will be a lot of good understanding and an opportunity to get to know each other and to solve some of the questions and maybe some of the misconceptions that we have. To start with, I would like Carisha Kuipers to talk to us about agriculture in the United States. Go ahead, Carisha. Thank you, Jesus. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carisha Kuipers, and I am the attaché for agricultural affairs in Madrid, and I have responsibility over Spain and Portugal. I would like to welcome you and thank you all for your taking part in today's seminar. This seminar is an opportunity to learn about livestock, cattle, and pig production in the United States and Spain. In terms of the livestock sector, Spain and the United States share a common approach to production and a shared commitment to modernization, increased efficiency, and sustainability. However, there are often a number of misconceptions about US agriculture, and many seem to believe that US livestock production and agricultural production in general is industrial and unsustainable. Nevertheless, the reality is that livestock producers in the United States are among the most advanced in the world and are committed to improving the sustainability of their operations in environmental, economical, and social terms. That is why today we want to take the opportunity to discuss livestock production models in both the United States and Spain, and the ways in which each system is attempting to boost sustainability. By doing so, we hope to demonstrate that our goals are the same. We all want to produce more with less, and to do it as sustainably as possible. So even if our methods may differ, our results are the same. Our speakers today will discuss how US and Spanish producers are working to advance and improve the sustainability of our livestock sectors. But first, I want to tell you a bit about our work at the Foreign Agricultural Service, or FAS, within the US Department of Agriculture, as well as about agricultural trade between our countries. FAS is one of 17 USDA agencies. We represent the US Department of Agriculture in third countries. At FAS, we work to defend the global interests of US farmers, seeking opportunities for their agricultural, fish, and forestry products. FAS is also involved in bilateral trade in agri-food products between the United States and the European Union. FAS has 98 offices covering 177 countries, and our head office is located in the capital, Washington, D.C. FAS has a public sector analysis and reporting function. We perform marketing and market development functions, and we provide institutional support to international trade in food, agriculture, and livestock. Public analysis and reporting on the Spanish agri-food sector is one of our top priorities. The following list includes some examples of the reports our office produces: biotechnology, grain, livestock, fruit, export guidelines, and more. All of these reports are public if you're interested. Another resource you may be interested in is one of our most important reports, which is called World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, WASDE. This report is published monthly and provides annual production estimates for the most important commodities such as grain, oilseeds, meat, sugar, and raw materials for food in general. These reports are available on this website, and the latest report was published on the 9th of November. Our office also liaises and facilitates communication with other USD agencies, such as APHIS, the Animal and Plant Inspection Service, which deals with animal and plant health issues, and FSIS, the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is like the EFSA in the European Union and is responsible for food safety of meat and egg products. It also facilitates communication with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is not part of the Department of Agriculture, which also ensures the safety of food products as well as medicines and drugs. I now want to take a few minutes to talk about agricultural trade between the United States and Spain. Next slide, please. In 2020, Spain was the third largest destination for US exports to the EU, behind the Netherlands and Germany, with $1.5 billion. This means a 20% decrease on the previous year due to the pandemic, as well as to a sharp drop in bulk products, mainly of raw materials for animal feed, such as soybeans, due to strong Chinese demand this year. However, agri-food exports from the United States to Spain have increased from January to August 2021, growing 9% more than the same period in 2020 by $1 million. Regarding Spain's exports to the US, you can see that they have been higher since 2015, given that the US sends commodities to Spain, whereas Spain mainly sends high-value products such as wine, olive oil, meat, cheese, and other value-added products. Although Spanish exports to the US also fell in 2020, they have recovered somewhat in 2021. Due to Spain's robust livestock sector, bulk commodities, which are shown in light green, intended for animal feed, were the most relevant category of US exports to Spain, especially soy. However, consumer-oriented products grew, and they are shown in dark green. They grew strongly, especially nuts, with these products being the most exported from the United States to Spain, mainly almonds. Meat products also fall into this category. In the wake of the pandemic, US agri-food exports to Spain were reactivated and grew in almost all categories and products. During this period, nuts accounted for almost half of US agri-food exports from US to Spain, and the second most exported product was soy, accounting for 21% of total exports. Due to trade disputes, such as EU tariffs, related to the steel-aluminium dispute, exports to Spain have been reduced, especially pulses and corn. I want to briefly mention that US corn exports to Spain have always been important to the Spanish livestock industry for use in animal feed. However, these exports have been affected by political issues. In the 1990s, exports declined due to disruptions in EU biotechnology approval. From 2018 to the present, US corn exports to Spain have been almost zero, mainly due to the EU tariffs on the US over the steel and aluminium dispute. With the agreement to lift these tariffs, which should happen on 1 January, we will see if US corn exports resume next year. US beef and pork exports to Spain have seen an upward trend over the last decade, reaching $7 million in 2019, largely involving beef. But due to COVID-19 and pandemic-related restrictions, these exports plunged in 2020. US beef in Spain is mainly destined for the hospitality sector, or HoReCa, which was a heavily damaged sector last year. On top of that, US beef prices rose last year. US beef exports to Spain in 2020 were 90% lower than they were in 2019. The main beef cuts exported to Spain are high value-added frozen pieces, basically destined for restaurants. This downward trend continued in the period from January to August 2021. Pork exports are generally very small and involve parts such as whole bone-in hams, tripe, offal, and bacon. We will see how the meat market evolves globally and what the Chinese demand does in the remainder of 2021 and next year. And now I would like to say a few words about how beef and pork are imported from the US to Spain. As a first step, it is important to note that all US and beef pork authorized for export to the EU must come from establishments that are eligible to export to the EU and compliant with all requirements. FSIS issues export certificates. All information in this regard can be found on the FSIS Export Library website. Both beef and pork programs specific to the EU are audited and verified by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS. As for beef, the requirements can be found in Chapter 7, the NHTC program, whereby beef must come from animals that have never been treated with growth-promoting hormones. Regarding pork, the requirements are contained in Chapter 8, the pig program, where pig meat destined for the EU must come from animals that are free of growth-promoting hormones such as ractopamine. This website features a list of US meat establishments that are approved by the EU. EU TRQs, or tariff rate quotas, for importing beef and pork from the USA are a bit of a complicated issue, and I will not go into it in too much detail in this seminar. But generally speaking, these quotas are quite a significant impediment. These links contain all the information on tariff rate quotas, or you can contact our office for more information. If you would like more information on any of these topics, we also have a report called Food and Agricultural Import Regulations and Standards, or FAIRS, which we publish annually. In it, you will find applicable regulations on exporting US food products to Spain. Otherwise, you can contact our office here in Madrid. I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Micro.
Jesús, tu micro. Sí, nos decía que Carissa, que muchísimas gracias por la exposición.
I was just saying, Carisha, thank you so much for your presentation and for going to the effort of doing it in Spanish. We're now going to talk about production in Spain, and to do so we have with us Esperanza. Esperanza, whenever you're ready. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank the US Embassy in Madrid, Carisha, for having invited me to join you in this seminar. I would also like to thank the Agricola Publishing Group and Jesus. I think this is a very interesting initiative because, as Jesus said at the beginning, the United States, European Union, and Spain are separated by an ocean. They are geographically distant countries, but they are not so different in their production models, especially in the livestock production model. We are, in fact, much closer than people might think. Particularly, Spain is a country that focuses very strongly on international markets, on competitiveness, production, challenges concerning sustainability, which is the focus of today's seminar. And both countries, I believe, are very agricultural in the sense that we are very concerned or very caring of our rural areas, which I think is something very significant that both of our societies share. We know, and we always say, that livestock is a source of food, but also a source of wealth and life in the rural area. And I know that rural areas in the United States feel the same about livestock production. It's inherent to the tradition and lifestyle of small urban areas. Livestock production, as I was saying, is a vital component. And in Europe and in Spain, we are, I was going to say, a small country, but we are just one of 27 countries, and yet we have huge productive diversity within our own country. And the greater this productive diversity is, the better. I do want to share just a few pieces of information with you. There are 160 million euros contributed by livestock. It accounts for 45% of all agricultural activity. And I wanted to say that we are the third country in terms of livestock production value in European Union, behind Germany and France, with an estimated production value of around 20 billion euros a year, which is no mean feat. Spain is the main producer of pork in the European Union, with 32.4 million heads, and before it was the United Kingdom that was the main producer, but now we are the first with 15.5 million heads of sheep. We also are second in terms of goat numbers, second only to Greece, and fourth in beef production. So we are, I think we can safely say, a very significant country in livestock production. And as I was saying, this is very well spread across the Spanish geography. We have very different models. We have intensive and extensive models. But nevertheless, we all follow a strategic approach from an economic, social, and environmental point of view. As I was saying, our models are varied, but I wanted to really highlight the commitment that Spain shows towards the EU production model, which is a very characteristic model of the EU policies and has been for a long time. This model seeks to produce diverse foods, quality foods, safe and healthy foods. It has concerned about the safety of its consumers and also the welfare of its animals and of the environment. And that, I think, is the essence of the policies and production models of our livestock establishments. And another characteristic, which I think is very particular to the European Union, and Carisha mentioned it earlier about genetically modified products, Spain has a very strong stance in terms of the technology of livestock production. This stance is not always shared by other EU members, but I did want to just underline that right now, because we believe in innovation and technology applied to food production, and we believe in biotechnology. I don't want to insist too much on transatlantic data exchanges, because I think Carisha has already discussed that. But I do want to insist on the fact that Spain is a country that is very much committed to international and foreign trade. It defends a bilateral approach and an understanding based on rules and laws, transparency, and stable trade agreements. So I believe that this meeting that we're holding here today is happening at a very suitable time, not only because some trade issues that we had been dragging for some time are now being solved, which Carisha mentioned, but also because we have recently signed an agreement between the European Union and the USDA to strengthen, to reinforce discussions and collaboration concerning worldwide agricultural affairs, which once again is the topic that we're discussing here today in this event. This agreement is based on the sustainability of our livestock production models and our resource management, the preservation of the environment, and the way we address the climate challenge in terms of how we adapt to this challenge and this crisis, and also agricultural exchanges and the resilience of our food systems. So this is a very interesting framework to work in, where I think both parties are keen to collaborate. And I also think this is very strongly linked to the Summit of Agricultural Systems, which was hosted by the United Nations recently. And this would be a good follow-up of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I think is also important is that both parties are able to work together, both the United States and the European Union, because we are key agents in the production of food around the world, working together to transform the way the world produces and consumes food, and also the way we conceive and we think about food. I think these are aspects where there is a lot of room for collaboration, and I am delighted to be able to move forward along these lines with seminars like this one. The challenges that livestock sectors face in the United States and the European Union are very diverse, and of course, some of these challenges are shared in our two countries. And I wanted to start with one of the last points I mentioned concerning this agreement between the USDA and the EU Agricultural Agency, and that has to do with exchanges and the resilience of the food system. Now, COVID-19 has posed a major challenge for the food systems of both our countries on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think that at least we have been able to gladly see that our sector is resilient in a crisis like this. However, no one can guarantee that this can be sustained in the future. We really need to learn the lesson. We need to draw sensible conclusions from what has happened. And that's why one of the things that has just been done at an EU level is to draw up a contingency plan to define the European response to food-related crises. It could be a pandemic like the one we're living now, or it could be any other sort of disaster or crisis. And some of the lessons we have learned, I'm going to share with you. The first one, which is very important, is a comprehensive approach to food systems, interdependency with other sectors, because we cannot just produce food. We depend on transport, we depend on packaging. So it is important to reinforce all of these interrelationships that we have with other sectors. It's important to also have good communication to make well-informed decisions and to also ensure that citizens feel safe and that there are no irrational behaviors, because there have been some anecdotes such as hoarding toilet roll, which may seem like a bit of an anecdote now, but at a time of crisis, this can give rise to irrational behaviors like this that can put the production system in check. Producing critical infrastructure and strategic interdependencies, and I'm going to talk about the ones that Spain has later. We have a foreign dependency on raw materials to feed animals. Carisha mentioned that earlier. Spain produces food and is able to feed its population. It feeds a lot of EU population as well, but it is strongly dependent on raw materials for animal feed, which come from other countries. Now that we've pulled through the pandemic, in subsequent months, what we have been seeing is that there are a series of factors such as bottlenecks, geopolitical tension in the energy field, and the economical reactivation itself in the US, in the EU, is all contributing to frictions in certain products and inputs which we perhaps hadn't foreseen, and that are a result, a byproduct of this interconnected market. We have issues such as energy prices, fuel prices, and how that is impacting, for example, fertilizer prices. In Spain, that is one example, and it also raises the prices of raw materials. This has been happening since late last year, and this concerns us. The minister mentioned this during the last meeting with the European Union. It concerns us essentially because of the impact it can have on benefits and on ranches in Spain, which, as I was saying, have had to live through rises in prices of around 20% in recent months. There's also the issue of energy costs and other inputs such as gas and oil. So these dependencies that we have on raw materials for animal feed, as I was saying, are one of our main concerns. This sector imports about 55% of grain that is consumed for animal feed, especially corn, barley, soy. And this is a weakness in terms of these activities in the worldwide market of raw materials. And this increase in costs also comes with new regulations such as the chain law, which helps to balance out this increase in costs throughout the value chain without choking just one given link in the chain, which will always be the weaker link. Along these lines, I wanted to mention another point that is part of the agreement between the EU and the United States that was signed recently, and that is the environmental aspect. The livestock industry in its development, just like all kinds of economic activities that have been taking place in recent years in our country, have had an environmental impact with an increase in emissions, which of course has a negative effect on the environment. In some cases, gases such as ammonia are damaging to health. Spanish livestock industry accounts for about 9% of greenhouse gas emissions in our emissions stock. It's not a very positive figure. It's a figure we have to reflect on. It's true that the amount of gas emitted per kilo of meat has been reduced. We now produce much more without having significantly increased our emissions. But we shouldn't get carried away or auto-complacent with these aspects. There's a lot of room for improvement in these initiatives. There are sector improvements, policy improvements in the European Union and internationally to drive and to promote this sector towards reducing its environmental impact. Plus, nowadays, the concept of sustainability goes beyond environmental or geoclimatic aspects. It covers concerns, consumer concerns, such as animal welfare, health, by reducing antibiotic content, which concerns the European citizens and probably the American population as well, and also ethical aspects to do with consuming proteins from animal sources. And in order to address all of these demands and needs that encompass sustainability, the United States and Spain have come to the table within the European Green Deal, and this will define the political agenda of all the member states of the European Union over the next few years. It is a roadmap which gives us some specific aspects, such as reducing phytosanitary products, 50% reduction of microbial products, improving animal welfare, improving the use of fertilizers and reducing it by about 20%, increasing the expanse of land that is intended for agricultural production in order to achieve 25% by 2030, and at least 10% of agricultural areas should be used for landscape. The European Union has policies which are truly common and have a shared budget, and they all aim to follow this sustainability roadmap in all three aspects: economic, social, and environmental. And so we, the member states, have the commitment and the duty to apply strategies and policies that really follow this sustainable ambition by 2023. On the 14th of July 2021, the European Commission presented a package of regulatory measures, which is known as Fit for 55, in order to reduce net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030 compared to levels in 1990 and to achieve net zero by 2050. Within this package, there are two very important regulations for the agricultural sector. We have the reduction of emissions in the production sector, and the agricultural sector is one which, like transportation, is very high. It has established a 40% reduction, and the aim is also to increase the amount of carbon absorbed by the agricultural sector and the forestry sector, aiming to absorb 43% more. And that is why we are now developing an important package in the regulatory sphere concerning livestock sustainability and agricultural sustainability. And on a broader note, also within the National Plan on Energy and Climate drawn up by the Spanish government. In livestock production, although data regarding climate challenge are what they are, we have seen that the environmental challenge keeps coming up constantly. And what we are trying to do is to combat the news pieces and articles which are criminalizing this livestock production. But socially in Spain, the fact is that society is responding very strongly, especially because of the concept of macro farms, industrial livestock production. Now, this is a concept that is not really very well defined because Spanish pork establishments have been restricted and regulated for years now, but there is proving to be an organized social response and social rejection towards livestock production. And this is forcing us to work harder on communication and to provide truly tangible data and indicators for a more sustainable livestock production model. And I also wanted to mention other aspects to do with sustainability of livestock production, which is everything that has to do with the circular economy and how livestock can contribute to that circular economy by reusing products such as manure for a more sustainable use of the ground, which avoids emissions and avoids contaminating lower layers of soils, for promoting the circular economy in animal welfare is also very important, and also in animal feed. I now would like to refer to a new EU regulation on forests, which is very much linked to what the US raw material production model can offer us. The European Union is working on a regulatory package whereby products originating from third countries have to guarantee that they are not promoting deforestation. And I believe that North American production can fully guarantee this lack of deforestation, which means it is in a strong position to replace other countries where these guarantees are not so clear. There are also other initiatives to broaden the range and the scope of initiatives for animal welfare. And I wanted to mention how in the European Unity, European Union, the first few steps have been made to discuss transformed animal proteins. This had disappeared from animal feeds in the year 2000 due to the bovine spongiform cephalopathy. This is now being reintroduced for pork, for beef. It had already been applied to fish. And the idea is that with these measures, we should achieve a gradual transition in the evolution of our sector to make us not only more sustainable environmentally, but also more resilient, and to ensure that we are able to grow in a balanced way, socially, environmentally, and economically. And I have to mention the economic sector because there can be no environmental sustainability if livestock producers don't make money. We can't expect anything from them if the market is unable to reimburse them accordingly. In summary, now is a time of significant change and of challenges for livestock on both sides of the Atlantic. And in the face of these challenges, I know that the Spanish livestock sector has, the way it has already done before, been prepared to solvently keep up its competitiveness and to even come out stronger. I would now like to insist on my thanks to the embassy, to the organizers, Carisha, Jesus, for inviting me to share this time with you. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias también a ti, Esperanza, porque en este...
Thank you very much, Esperanza, because in this short space of time, you have mentioned two very important things, and I would like to draw on two. This three-legged stool of the economy, agriculture, environment, and geopolicy, which affects us in international trade. Carisha mentioned this earlier when talking about corn. Hopefully, as from January, Spanish livestock producers will be able to benefit from lower prices and also cooperation, which is absolutely essential. So I want to say thank you to both of you for this introduction, let's say. This is, let's say, a starter to the meal that we're going to be having today. Thank you so much. Now, before going on, I would like to say that for those who are listening to us, for those who are following the event live, you can send us your questions through the YouTube chat box. If you have questions for Cheyenne or for any of our subsequent speakers, you can post those questions in the chat feature. And secondly, I'd like to say that you don't really need to take notes about the data that Carisha or Esperanza have shared, because we have an email address, which is agmadrid@fas.usda.gov. I'm going to repeat it just in case. It's agmadrid@fas.usda.gov. And that email address you can use to ask for the presentations that we are sharing today. And after just this brief note, we can now move on to the second dish, the main dish in our menu today, which is sustainable production of beef and pork in the United States. This presentation will be delivered by Cheyenne McInderfer, who is the head of the export department of the USMEF, and she will be presenting it in this video.
Hello there. I'm excited to be with you today to talk about how U.S. beef and pork is some of the most sustainably produced meat in the world and something you can feel good by. Let me start by telling you a little about myself. I've worked for USMEF for 9 years and as a third-party food safety auditor and animal welfare auditor before that. I grew up in New Mexico, located in the southwestern United States, where we managed a few ranches before starting a custom meat slaughter business. That business is still going, about 30 years old now. Today, my day job is with USMEF, but my husband and I also run a cow-calf operation with Gelbvieh and Angus Genetics and help with my in-laws' dryland farming operation, where we farm wheat, millet, and milo. It is very much a family affair, as I will talk more about on the next slide. You can see my daughter and husband checking our cattle during feeding. We have to feed during the winter as we don't grow grass year-round here in Colorado. And on the left, you can see our cattle on summer pasture in the eastern plains of Colorado, part of the Great Plains that I'll discuss later. I'm not sure why, but a common misconception of U.S. agriculture seems to be that we're all big industrial or factory farms. I honestly don't even know what a factory farm is supposed to be. However, I can tell you that 98% of all farms in the U.S. are family-owned or operated. And those families produce about 90% of the ag outputs in the U.S. and help to feed not only their families, but families all over the world. I think we get a bad rap because of our economies of scale and large enterprises. However, one family can run 500 mama cows. They can feed 30,000 cattle in a feedlot or farm 10,000 acres or 4,000 hectares. That doesn't make them factory farmers. It just allows them to work at a scale that ensures they can leave something for the next generation to take over. So in summary, U.S. farming and ranching truly is a family business. But like many places in the world, farming and ranching in the U.S. comes under threat every single day. Urban development or other non-ag uses continue to shrink our arable land. Arable being land that's suitable for farming crops, and non-arable land not suited for farming crops, but can be grazed by cattle or sheep to produce a high-quality protein product. I think this map is important to show because it really highlights the need to grow and raise more with less. This is really the hallmark of U.S. ag. We embrace technology and innovation to make more food with less land, less natural resources, and less emissions. I also want to use this map to show the green, yellow, and gray areas. Anywhere without green is really not suited to farming crops. In fact, a little under 1/2 of US land is not arable or suitable for farming. We'll talk about this later, but this is why moving to a 100% plant-based diet is not going to benefit US greenhouse emissions in any significant manner. You can also see that we cannot support growing crops anywhere in the US that doesn't already grow crops. Cattle are raised in all 50 states, but their importance to the West particularly is really highlighted here. Some of these Western states like Nevada just do not have much arable land to grow crops. But rural communities there can continue to exist because cattle or sheep provide revenue and a food source off of land that would otherwise sit unused. So US Ag has evolved to make the best of what we have in our varied geographic offerings. We have feet of topsoil and ample moisture in the Midwest, making it the most efficient row crop producing region in the world. We have dry arid plains and desert in the West that don't support crops, but are perfect for grazing cattle and sheep. And that way we're still able to produce food off that land. So to summarize, due to technology and innovation, we continue to feed more people with less, and efficiency equals sustainability. With advances in practices like precision agriculture and grain finishing, we continue to grow more with less water, less fertilizer use, and reduced emissions. And land that doesn't receive income from farming or grazing, that will be lost to development. And since we now know and are learning more each day that crop ground and pasture land managed in certain ways can sequester or capture carbon from the atmosphere, that gives farmers and ranchers a superpower that a city just can't provide. This is why there's so much talk of carbon credits happening in the US and globally right now. Major companies like airlines and manufacturers cannot sequester carbon on their own, but they can enlist farmers and ranchers, those who have been taking care of the soil for thousands of years, to do just that. In fact, we're already guardians of land. 15% of our ag lands are already used for conservation and wildlife habitat, and that will likely increase under new incentives proposed by the White House. We also have USDA, our ag government agency, programs to ensure marginal crop land stays in grass and is not farmed. This arose out of the unfortunate Dust Bowl years, and we now know that just not all ground can or should be farmed. My family uses some of these conservation programs to provide income on native grassland that would be susceptible to blowing and erosion if farmed. So our government continues to recognize, again, the superpower of farmers and ranchers to help protect thousands of acres of land in our country. I would also like to mention deforestation, as I know that is a hot topic globally when we talk about ag lands. Rest assured that U.S. farming and ranching does not contribute to deforestation. In fact, our forests here in the U.S. have been stable to growing for decades. We graze cattle on lands with no forests, like where I live on the prairie, and we graze them in forest in places like California, contributing to forest health. Our feed grains for cattle and hogs are grown in the U.S. and not imported from any other countries. All right, let's move on to some discussion on pork and beef production in the U.S. On the pork side, we're already world leaders in sustainable pork production, and pork production is responsible for a very negligible share of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see here. When talking about greenhouse gas emissions, I think one of our issues in the U.S. is that we don't get credit for all the advances we've been making for decades. When you're already very efficient, there aren't huge changes you can make. However, continuous improvement is a key priority of this industry, and why we will be seeing hugely ambitious emission reduction targets released by the U.S. pork industry later this year. But we have seen big gains in the last few decades, and you can see those reductions here with more to come. A huge bonus for our hog industry is that we have corn and soy right next door, literally. Many of our hog farms grow corn and soy on site, meaning the emissions produced by transporting those feedstuffs to the animals is greatly reduced. We're not hauling them across an ocean. They're literally just coming, right next door. We just use the land for what it's suited for, and that amazing topsoil and moisture coming from the sky, no irrigation needed in the corn belt of the Midwest, is perfectly suited to produce not only ethanol for biofuel use here and globally, but also those grains to make delicious U.S. pork. And don't forget about manure. Manure gets a bad rap due to emissions, but we've seen huge strides in capturing those gases and preventing them from entering the atmosphere. But don't forget fertilizer. Half the fertilizers used globally are livestock manure. And manure is a necessary fertilizer for those farming organically, as they cannot use most synthetic fertilizers. So no animals equals no fertilizer for most of the world, and essentially all organic producers. Here's a tractor spraying manure from their hog farm onto their fields. Again, you can see the hog barns behind them, less transportation-related emissions when the feed, the fertilizer, and the animals are all right here. Okay, let's talk about beef. Here's a picture of my cows a few years ago when we had lots of rain. It is not always this green on the prairie. I want to start by saying that we're already the most sustainable beef producers in the world when looking at greenhouse gas emissions and continuous improvement. Again, less efficient producers in the world, such as in Africa, can make huge gains here. But that doesn't mean that we aren't continuously trying to get better. And feedlots, as you see in the picture, are a huge part of why we're so efficient and why other countries around the world, like Australia and Argentina, are starting to utilize this practice more and more as well. So how did we become the world leader in producing more beef with less greenhouse gas emissions? Well, there are a few factors outlined here. First is high quality feeds. Again, we're lucky to have the geography and the climate to grow corn for our signature grain finished beef. But we also use products that would go to waste, such as byproducts of corn used for ethanol production and pulp left by sugar beets after the sugar is extracted for human use. Second, less heat stress. We select for animals that better tolerate heat, and those animals go to certain parts of the U.S. So if you're in the hot southern U.S., those cattle are bred to be more tolerant to withstand heat. Third, improved genetics. This isn't GMO, as we don't have GMO cattle, but rather selecting for animals used for breeding that are more efficient feeders, again, built to tolerate heat or humidity based on where they are in the U.S., and selecting for smaller frame cattle and using crossbreeding to get that hybrid vigor. Fourth, improved reproductive performance. Again, this is where crossbreeding comes in, is using breeds with more maternal traits means getting a calf for each cow each year. A cow just grazing and releasing methane all through her life and not producing a calf each year isn't beneficial for the rancher, and it's not beneficial for the environment. And lastly, faster growth, which I'll cover on the next slide. Grain finishing uses less natural resources like water and results in less emissions because that steer heifer reaches a slaughter-ready weight quicker, thus releasing less methane over their lifetime than a grass-finished steer that may take 3 to 4 years to get ready for slaughter. I'm not bashing grass-finished beef, because I'm glad when people eat beef of any kind due to the hugely beneficial nutrient density of beef. But the fact of the matter is that when we get our animals to slaughter weight in 13 to 24 months versus 3 to 4 years, that allows for less resource use and less methane from each animal emitted over their lifetime. I say all that, but I want to clarify another common misconception on our grain finished beef. Even though our beef is grain finished, making it more sustainable and extra delicious, those animals still only spend 3 to 4 months on that high energy diet, and that happens right before slaughter. Most of their lives are still spent on grass. Calves aren't born and go directly to a feedlot. All right. So moving on, I want to ask you, when you think about the most fragile ecosystems in the world, what do you say? Maybe the Great Barrier Reef, maybe the Amazon. Well, one of the most at-risk ecosystems in the world and one of the last great remaining grasslands is located right where I sit now and smack dab in the middle of the US and Canada, the Great Plains of North America. So why should you care about the Great Plains across the ocean? Well, prairies have the ability to store as much carbon below the ground as forests can above ground. So that means that we shouldn't only worry about our forests, but also our world's remaining grasslands. These grasslands act as a huge vault of carbon, but without grass and plants to hold that carbon, there's no carbon sequestration or capture. Remember me talking about pavement and concrete can't store carbon before. What does this mean for US meat and why am I talking about it in this presentation? Well, livestock grazing improves soil health, increasing the capacity of those plants to store carbon. Again, this is because of the nutrient benefits of manure, but also because grazing pressure makes those plants healthier. Think about it like this. A clump of grass never gets grazed. It doesn't have to make deep roots because nothing is going to munch on it and make it stay steady in the ground. Well, if there is grazing pressure, that plant is incentivized to grow deeper and stronger roots to hold that plant in when it's grazed. And those roots are where most of the carbon sequestration magic happens. This has been shown in areas that grazing animals have been removed in the name of protection. Well, those folks quickly learned that those plants weren't as healthy and couldn't compete with other weeds. This is why the benefits of grazing have been clearly shown time and time again. I'm not saying overgrazing, as that can be disastrous for grasslands, but properly managed grazing has huge benefits. This picture is of the Pawnee Buttes in my area, a lookout point used by Pawnee Indians when bison roam the plains. We have less bison today, but cattle now provide that grazing pressure that bison used to provide, all while emitting less methane because we have less cattle in the US than we had bison back then. Okay, we talked about grazing and manure benefiting plant productivity and health. What else? Well, livestock hides and manure also spread seeds, a critical vehicle for spreading plant biodiversity. Grazing lands and areas also provide wildlife habitat and corridors. I see antelope, deer, and pheasants often by my house and in our pastures. Fire mitigation, this has come up again due to the devastation of the California wildfires last year. In fact, there were hearings this year in Washington, D.C. to highlight the benefits of grazing livestock in forest areas to help manage plant overgrowth that provides so much fuel when these fires start, especially in states that don't allow much logging. Cattle and sheep can benefit forest health as grazing is a hugely powerful tool to help keep that undergrowth healthier and from getting overgrown in the first place. And last but not least, keeping rural America thriving. We can't farm everywhere, as you saw on that map before, but we can graze cattle in most parts of the US since they can thrive on that non-arable land. This means that many rural areas that can't be farmed can only provide income from land with ranching. This picture on the left is from my home area in New Mexico. This area used to be a huge coal mining community, but as coal has been phased out, those glory days are long gone. And the top industry that remains now with land that is not suitable for crops, well, that is cattle. I grew up with families whose ancestors from Ireland started ranching here over 100 years ago. And cattle remain the thread that holds this corner of the state together. Without cattle, the small towns die. I grew up in a town of 90 people and graduated high school with 7 kids. And the 2 businesses in that town that provide jobs, cattle, and the phone company. No cattle equals millions of acres of barren land and the death of thousands of small communities in America. So this really reiterates that at the end of the day, we cannot forget the benefits of livestock when looking at the 3 environmental pillars of sustainability, including social and economic. Okay, I want to finish with a few more common misconceptions. First, do cattle eat all of the corn or other crops that could be going to humans? Nope. Last year, only 7% of all corn harvested in the US went to cattle feed, and that's about the size of the city of Houston in Texas, as you can see here. So to conclude our beef discussion, US beef production only accounts for 2% of all US emissions. And this is old data, so hopefully we have more recent stats to show you next time. So there is talk about beef being bad for the environment, but it's a fraction compared to other industries in regards to emissions like transportation and electricity. In fact, if all Americans stopped eating animal products, we would only see our total emissions reduced by 0.36%. And that doesn't even include the superpower farmers and ranchers have to capture carbon, like we talked about, and that global companies are going to rely on for their carbon credits. And lastly, when we look at total US ag and forestry emissions and sequestration data, we're already carbon negative as we store more than we emit, and we will continue to get better. Thanks again for listening to me today. You can tell I'm passionate about the prairie, so I leave you another picture of my cows doing their part with grazing pressure, making the plants and soil better at storing carbon. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. We have amazing experts in the US who are better versed on the technicalities of greenhouse gases and emissions than I am. But if I can't answer your question, I'll make sure to get you an answer after today. So thanks again.
Pues una presentación interesante. Para los que queréis hacer preguntas.
What an interesting presentation. For those of you who have questions for Cheyenne, I would like to repeat that on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the YouTube channel, there is a chat box. And I'm now going to invite our Spanish counterpart to speak. That is Manuel Lainez, who's going to be talking to us about sustainable beef and pork production in Spain. He is an expert in the agricultural area. So, Manuel, whenever you're ready. Thank you very much, Jesus. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar. It's very interesting. Thanks to the US Embassy as well for giving me the chance to share just a few ideas about how pork and beef production in Spain is sustainable. Let me see if I can do that now. Well, I'm going to try and share a few ideas on this topic. Here we go. I think sustainability has already been defined as the need that we have to preserve natural resources for future generations. Esperanza was mentioning this earlier, all three sides of sustainability, which are social, economic, and environmental. And it's important to understand that sustainability is nothing simple. It has a lot of sides to it and a lot of different approaches. In the environmental area, we have greenhouse gas emissions, resources such as water. We have biochemical flows, the use of water, biodiversity, and natural capital. Economically, we have keeping up activities, developing the economy in the rural area. We have also social aspects such as work conditions, the population, because this is linked to healthy diets. So sustainability has a lot of different sides to it. So let's focus a bit on sustainable production. And to do so, I'm going to share with you some slides on what the beef and pork production systems are like in Spain. I'd like to talk about what has been done to improve productive efficiency in recent years and how this productive efficiency means greater sustainability per kilo of meat produced. I'd like to give you some data about what sustainability means in these productions and also talk about the potential that livestock has of promoting sustainability in our country. To promote sustainability, and also I'd like to share a little bit about what this sector is doing towards sustainability, which encompasses the entire value chain. In order to produce meat, we all know that what we need is a business or an organization which has a productive process. And depending on the type of facilities and feeds that it uses, they will basically follow one of two systems which appear to be completely different, which are extensive and intensive systems. However, the differences between them are not quite as significant as they seem, because ultimately the only difference between the two sectors is the type of food, the insulation used, and how the animals are handled in each of these areas. So the differences are not so big. Here are some data on how this type of production systems are spread across the Spanish geography. This is a relatively recent publication. On the left, we can see we have pork farms all across the country. We have both intensive and extensive ones in all of areas. And moving on to extensive pork production, this is what we can see here on the right. So mainly it is focused on Iberian pig areas. And the same is true in this image at the bottom here, as well as the region of Murcia, the Balearic Islands, and some areas in the north of the country. So this is very specific to certain breeds of pork. 55% of these farms are for commercial purposes, 44.7% are for self-consumption. We have 72% intensive farms, 28% extensive farms, and 95% are focused on intensive production. In beef, this was a recent study carried out by Pro Vacuno, which shows us that in nursing cows, 94% can be found in extensive farming facilities, whereas in feed cows spend a long time with their mothers in these extensive farms. And then in combined facilities where they have both nursing cows and feed cows, there is combined data. This gives us an idea also of size, where we can see that beef ranches in our country, which include both nursing cows and feed cows, what we see is that there are a lot of small ranches and a relatively small number of large ranches, which are just 27% of the total. So they vary significantly in size, and especially extensive farming establishments do. Regarding the evolution of productive efficiency, this has a lot to do with sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions. This is a chart that shows how data have evolved in numeric productions on pork farms, where there has been a significant growth, reaching figures in order of what you can see here on the screen. But the important thing that this graph shows is that they are all upward lines. And going on to closer data from 2020, to talk about a system that monitors a lot of white pork production in Spain, what we can see is that there is significant productivity, significant production activity, and also a significant number of suckling pigs, with a daily average gain of 696 and some great conversion rates. So our pork livestock production in Spain is very efficient in the use of its resources. In beef, we don't have such comprehensive data. We need to focus on how production has evolved. And here is just some examples of mean average gain with data provided by the Ministry of Agriculture on beef production in Spain. There has been a good pace and there is a difference between male and female cattle. And now what is behind this is a lot of technology and a lot of investment by the establishments. I'm going to show you some examples of what's being done, such as really adjusting their intake, their diets to the ability these animals have to grow so that no resources are wasted, individualized monitoring of each animal. In the case of beef, there is close monitoring. We have close control on reproduction, factors that affect the animals, such as heat stress, animal stress, food, all in order to boost efficiency. And this monitoring requires digitalization with tools that are being optimized in our country. And there is also very close control of animal welfare and health, Because when we improve in these aspects, we ultimately improve efficiency and we can become more efficient in our use of resources. Water is another very relevant aspect. Here we can see how water consumption has progressed. The water footprint in each ranch in Spain has been lower, has been decreasing in Spain year on year per kilo of pork provided. Regarding certain studies published, we have stock reports that show that there was a rise between the 90s and 2005, and then a gradual descent. These are data from 2019. There has been a provisional study that was published recently by the Ministry of Ecological Transition, which shows that livestock accounts for 14% of emissions. But it's also true that there are sectors such as transport, bionics, and everything linked to energy consumption of fuel resources dropped last year due to the pandemic. And of course, that means that the percentage that agriculture contributes to these emissions has risen, but that doesn't mean that we haven't improved in our efficiency. Looking at each sector, we can see that between 1990 to 2019, the amount of methane produced and nitric oxide has increased. But if we were to compare it with the huge growth in population that we have achieved, both in white pork and Iberian pork, and also in beef, then really those figures, as Esperanza was saying, are positive, a very positive trend, and they would in fact represent a decrease. This shows what each livestock sector contributes to emissions. Beef has the strongest contribution because of enteric fermentation. And another way of analyzing emissions and sustainability on the whole would be to analyze the life cycle. Here we have some average data on a worldwide level. We have where beef, this is published by Poor and Nemesek. It's a very reputed source. And here it says that beef produces almost 60 kilos, of CO2 equivalent, whereas pork is only accounting for 7.3. The situation in Spain is that certain studies have been conducted, like this one, by the University of Cordoba, where we can see that emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are in the range of 30 to 40 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of meat, which is much lower than that 60% average worldwide that we were looking at in the previous slide. This is another study from several years ago, and it shows that in Europe, we are very sustainable and we are well below the average, the world average. This is another study that's being conducted, which focuses on measuring greenhouse gas emissions in each farm in order to give them individual guidelines on how to improve. Regarding the white pork sector, we have some data as well. This publication studied the life cycle of pork in Catalonia, in the Catalonian region of Spain. In terms of climate change, emissions are about 4.96, which is below that 7.3 average, worldwide average that we were looking at earlier. We know that Catalonia is very significant in white pork production in Spain. So it's quite a representative figure that we're looking at now. And as was mentioned recently in the United Kingdom, we are in the process of reducing environmental impact in these very significant categories, such as global warming, terrestrial acidification, and others that really concern the population nowadays. And something else that Cheyenne was mentioning is carbon sequestration, because life cycle assessments often don't consider how significant this is. It was a study on ecological or organic production in Spanish prairies with all kinds of livestock products. And you can see the data here. In beef, cattle, carbon is sequestered in order of 25 to 30%. So out of all of the emissions, about 25 to 30% are sequestered. And in Iberian pig, in extensive farms, more emissions are being sequestered than are being produced. So taking into account these data, the conclusion we can draw is that our productive systems are already sustainable in some ways and could already be defined as carbon neutral. And another important aspect, although this doesn't show the difference between pork and beef, it does reflect production of sheep milk in Spain. And here in black is the amount of carbon sequestered with a sector that has such a huge range of variability. What we can think is that there is a lot of room for improvement in technology to improve sustainability and to significantly boost carbon sequestration in the soil. Because just as was being described about the US, our livestock activity revolves the fact that that most of our land can be used for pasture. And that's where we have our pigs, our cows, our sheep, covering 25 million hectares that are suitable for grazing, but are not arable. They would not be used for other agricultural uses. These systems store biodiversity, and they cater for a whole series of ecological functions. And also these territories are being underused and underexploited. This has been said in quite a lot of studies. And some even say that we are using only 23% to 45% of the resources in those areas. And we've already seen the damage that can be caused by not using these resources properly. We have a lot of ecosystem services. Different researchers have produced different data in Spain about which fields of our livestock production, especially extensive livestock production, could contribute to the global improvement of sustainability. Esperanza Orellana also mentioned the circular economy. Here we can see what manure and purines can contribute. If we want to achieve the sustainable goals of reducing using more organic fertilizers, then that's what we're going to have to do. If we want to use biogas by making the most of manure and purines, then there are options to do so. Admittedly, there are less options than in other areas of Europe. But yes, there are areas in Spain where this could be better used, and we must do so if we can, thanks to this circular economy concept. And I'd also like to insist on the relationship between depopulated areas that are at great risk of being depopulated, and the location of pork and beef farms in these two different maps. Just to give you an example that would be linked to data from ProVacuno, 29% of beef production is located in areas that are at severe risk of depopulation. 10% is in those that are slightly less at risk, And of course, there is a very small percentage, 13%, in what it would be considered urban areas. So the link between livestock and the rural area, and specifically rural areas at risk of depopulation, is a very, very close link. And now just a few moments to tell you what is now being worked on. The interprofessional associations in these sectors that we're talking about, which are Provacuno, Interporc, and ASIF, are working on sustainability. They have a carbon neutral strategy, which was approved a few years ago, and largely what they're doing is working in collaboration with scientists whose goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they recently published a series of best practice guidelines with livestock owners taking part in drawing up these guidelines. This is an opportunity to improve efficiency, to talk about carbon bonds, carbon credits, and see how the sector stands to gain from these improvements in efficiency, because eventually they will be able to. And we also need a transparency policy. There is also another association called ASOPROVAC that goes to individual farms and talks to them about how they can improve. And Interporc has two different strategies, one in the short term and one in the mid-long term. In the short term, they intend to raise awareness and provide training throughout the productive sector. They intend to generate a platform for sustainability. They aim to promote innovation, not just in terms of primary livestock production, but also throughout the entire value chain, although that is less relevant to the final emissions data. So it's about working all along the life cycle and providing an observatory of Interporc sustainability. And in the mid and long term, they aim to analyze the life cycle analysis and promote research projects to optimize the value chain. And they're currently in the process of developing a scientific committee. ASIC is also working on similar lines. This professional association aims to once again raise awareness, to create an innovation and investigation and research agenda, seeking to foster knowledge and also to provide a point of interaction between scientists and the technical side of it all and the value chain itself. They will also work on analyzing the life cycle to detect room for improvement. And they also have two work groups, the technical sustainability work group with scientists and businesses, and then the scientific support group where all the scientists who work to support these areas are trying to contribute. And as Esperanza mentioned earlier, there are also a series of regulations that are being implemented in the pork sector. They have begun to be applied in so-called intensive farms. There is a set schedule and agenda for all that. And there is another royal decree that establishes how beef farms need to be organized and structured in terms of emissions and ammonia and so on. And that's all from me. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be delighted to answer them.
Si puedo, déjame conectar.
Sí. Manuel, muchísimas gracias por la capacidad de
Thank you very much, Manuel, for so neatly summarizing so many topics in such a short amount of time. And I appreciate that because we're actually running a little bit behind schedule. And now we have Cheyenne McIntyre with us, who's going to be answering the questions, any questions that might come through the chat box or that we might give her now. I've seen a lot of possible points for synergy and collaboration and a joint interest in the environment from different points of view because each country is different. But if you agree, Cheyenne and Manuel, I'm going to address a joint question to you. I'd like to be very concise. What percentage of large, small and medium farms of beef and pork do you have in Spain and in the US? Do you know the number? Just so that people can get an idea, because maybe people think that in the US it's all big farms, whereas in Spain they're all small. Do you have any data?
A Chayanne, porque, bueno, por empezar,
I think I might leave Cheyenne to answer that, but hang on, actually, while it's being translated, I'll just say that Pro Vacuno's data are quite clear. We'd have to actually define what is a big and a small farm, but the data are quite clear. And also, we've had a little look at the map of intensive and extensive farms. What percentage of farms are there that have X number of animals on their farms? Well, I don't actually know, but really there are not as many big farms as people think. There's a lot of small ones. Cheyenne, do you have a number?
So our breakout is not small, medium, and large, but I will share the data that I do have. And my heater just came on, so hopefully you can hear me okay. It's not super current data, but the most recent data we have is that out of about 730,000 beef cow farms and ranches in the US, 90% of those had less than 100 head of cattle. So that makes the average herd size about 43 head. That's on the cattle side, the beef cattle side, so not dairy. And then on the hog side, of about 66,000 hog operations in the US, 78% of those had less than 100 head of hogs. So the average inventory size of the US, because we do have quite large hog farms as well, so when you average those in, is about 1,000 head or 1,100 head of hogs is the average hog farm size. But again, a majority of those have less than 100 hogs. So we do have very large operations in the US, but at the end of the day, the average being, less than 50 head on the cattle side and less than 100 head on the hog side, again, goes to show that a lot of those are still pretty small farms for when you think of the US.
Muchas veces los tópicos son para romperlos.
Often we need to break these taboos, these misconceptions. Another question that I'd like you to answer is regarding smart farming. To combat damage to the environment, what smart solutions do you think there are in the future? Manuel, perhaps you first?
Es una herramienta fundamental.
Well, I think this is a fundamental tool, and in my presentation I wanted to put that message across, because in the inputs that come into productive systems, the most impacting input is food. And farms, whether they are beef farms, pork farms, and regardless of their size, ultimately all need to be efficient. And new technologies and precision feeding can give them the opportunity to adjust the ingredients used and adjust the amounts of protein in these diets, as well as adjusting the overall amount that the animals eat. And there's another important aspect, which is the animal welfare and health, which are crucial in, first of all, ensuring their well-being, but secondly, improving efficiency, because each individual animal that dies on a farm is a waste, let's say, of all the resources that have gone into that animal. So to improve animal welfare and to reduce the impact on animal health, anything we do towards that will contribute to improving efficiency and sustainability. And in these two fields, animal health and animal well-being, a lot of precision technology is now being introduced to better monitor these animals on an ongoing basis and to make real-time decisions instead of waiting for a farmer to rock up on the farm and see problems. So technology can be really helpful, and it can also help to see whether there is undergrazing or overgrazing. All of this can be done through satellite monitoring, for example. The technology is already there, and it's going to be very helpful in improving in sustainability and efficiency rates. Cheyenne, is it a similar situation in the States?
Yes. So in addition to a lot of the advances in looking at animal welfare, as Manuel discussed, which we utilize a lot here as well, I'll talk a little bit about the feed grain side, because that obviously is a critical component of the entire life cycle of the U.S. meat supply. So being corn and soy on the pork side and corn on the beef side. The U.S. model of producing food, similar to what Esperanza said about embracing technology and innovation, is the same here. I mean, in the US, it's technology, innovation, and productivity. And the tools that our farmers and ranchers are using just continue to blow my mind every day. Things like when you look at precision agriculture and applying fertilizer to fields, and tracking down to the ounce or gram in Europe's case, what's applied to the, a specific inch or half a foot of an area, not applying fertilizer to areas of the field that don't need it, in-row planting, cover crops, which are about to be financially incentivized in the U.S. Through some bills going through the U.S. government right now. It's just amazing, what we can do with technology and all from your phone, that they can track within their tractor when looking at input use. And on things on the grazing side, we've been using electric fences help us to rotational graze. But, I've seen rotational grazing in the UK, for example, and they have so much grass that they can move their cattle in small parts each day. I mean, out in the West, where we can only run, one pair, a pair, a cow and a calf, for about 20 acres. I don't remember what that is in hectares, sorry. But our stocking density is very, very high for the low for the acres we have. We have huge pastures, so rotational grazing for us can be really difficult to go and move fences each day. So looking at things like virtual fencing, where the cows wear the collars, is being tested commercially here, which would really benefit, our very large dry area ranches. So I think we continue to see technology become more critical in achieving these climate smart practices.
Bueno, recuerdo a la gente que está viendo la
I would just like to remind everyone who is watching or listening, you can send us your questions. Please don't be shy. I have another question for both of you. What are stock breeders doing to achieve this lowering of greenhouse gas emissions and towards achieving the COP26 pledges? Do you have any specific data on what stock breeders in the USA and in Spain are doing to meet the global methane pledge, Manuel? Well, I think methane in beef is a clear issue. We know what's worrying people, but methane is produced depending on the amount of indigestible fiber that they intake. So what we need to do is improve the grazing, the land that they graze on, to ensure that the fiber these animals are eating is more easily digestible. And they know that methane means a loss of resources that go into food, so they want to minimize that loss. And in terms of animals with higher concentrates in their food, that's also a topic that needs to be addressed. And that's the issue with beef, but there's also the topic of purines. Ultimately, it's about being more efficient and not wasting resources such as purine. And applying these purines is a topic that I think is very important. So some things are linked to food and others are linked to managing purines. What's the situation in the States, Cheyenne?
Yes, so obviously the U.S. and the EU spearheaded this global methane pledge. So we're going to have to show some significant advances there. Right now our government is saying that they will regulate oil and gas methane emissions, but not regulate on the ag side, which we are in favor of because we want to see those voluntary incentives, which the U.S. ag industry has been receptive to for decades. Like I said, we use that in conservation. Land programs, et cetera. So right now, what we're hearing from USDA, which is our ag agency, is that they'll use, existing, agencies within that to improve manure management, cap manure lagoons, and increase efforts to finance methane digesters and biogas energy opportunities. Biogas is obviously a hugely developing industry in the US, so seeing more finance put to that. And then on the cattle side, obviously we're a huge dairy producer as well. I don't cover dairy, but we work a lot hand in hand because obviously both beef cows and dairy cows release methane. So there's a lot of research on both sides happening on feed additives, as Manuel said, and different types of feeding to reduce the methane through that enteric fermentation process. So another group collaboration that was announced by the US government is the Ag Innovation Mission that was announced with the UAE. And they've already secured $4 billion out of their $8 billion goal to do a lot of research, within climate smart ag. And one of the initial projects or innovations, for instance, they call them, that's already been decided, is looking at reducing emissions in cattle through, whether feed additives or whatnot. So we'll continue to see more research on that globally and in the US.
Jesús, si me permites, quisiera añadir.
Jesus, if you don't mind, I'd just like to add something because when I was listening to Cheyenne, I remembered that there's another important point that I didn't mention in response to your question. And that's linked to next generation funds. The meat value chain sector has sent out a proposal and it has shared its strategy for next generation. And in this proposal, it discusses the interest that pork and beef producers have. And there are about 1,500 stock breeders taking part in this. And what they have proposed or what they're working on in pork is to introduce digesters for biogas. And in beef, as well as these digesters, they are suggesting if they can use these funds, they will spend them on reconditioning manure facilities and ultimately defining strategies that will reduce emissions not only of methane, but nitrous oxide and ammonia as well, which are the most complex and the ones that most need addressing. Yes, so it's funding that is ultimately intended to improve the environment. Well, people seem to be sending in questions in the chat box. One question is repeated, and it says, how can we improve the social perception regarding the high efficiency, sustainability in Spain and the USA? Because transparency seems to be somewhat lacking, and so does communication. Alfonso says, how can we improve our public perception? Because there is huge concern, especially I know in Spain there is, because public opinion on livestock and breeders is quite negative. So how can we combat that? How can we improve the way we are perceived? Maybe Manuel can go first. Well, I think there's only one way of doing that, and that is by really communicating the reality of the sector, sharing real data and comparing it with other sectors in the economy. I think that the Director General, Esperanza, was mentioning it earlier. It's as if there is this stigma on livestock farming as if it were the ultimate culprit of everything, whereas actually it has a very economic and social role, a very strong role. And emissions are actually not as bad as they seem. If we were to analyze the overall impact that it has, we would probably see that in the long term, it's able to achieve carbon neutrality or climate neutrality, let's say. And what we need to do, as I was saying, is communicate. It's to really get to the bottom of these opinions, and if they're not based on correct data, then we should correct those data. What's the situation in the United States, Cheyenne? Is it similar? Is social perception different to that of livestock farmers?
Yeah, we are facing a lot of negativity in the US as well, which makes it disheartening to be in this industry and feel attacked, as I'm sure producers in Spain as well. So, and I think anyone in agriculture, we've struggled to tell our story, right? So we're trying to figure out the best way to do that. And that's really the $1 million question you asked. I think this year, with the UN Food Systems Summit, where we saw a lot of global attacks on livestock production, the encouraging thing was to see that all livestock producing countries around the world, I think, really came together like they never have before to highlight the benefits of having animal protein on the plate, whether it's beef, eggs, dairy, whatever it may be. And there was a lot of that anti-meat messaging at COP26 as well. And I think when we see that, we see these major global pressures against meat specifically that can make you, wonder what the future looks like. But we have a great story to tell. I think what we saw today on both sides are great. They're great facts and it's great data. I think from our side, consumers don't always want to see the data, but they need to know that data is behind the claims you're making. So I think here in the US, we're going to do updated life cycle assessments on the beef and pork side so we can show, the benefits there. Our beef industry came out this year and stated they will be climate neutral by 2040. I think we're very close to that, but again, we need to show the data with our sequestration benefits in addition to our methane emissions, how that looks. So data at the end of the year, better life cycle assessments to show that, and then just being able to talk to consumers. And then, I echo everything Manuel said, the 3 pillars of sustainability. We try and highlight the social and economic benefits, because if you're not profitable enough to leave land to your children to ranch or farm, that quintessentially is the sustainability crux, right? Being able to leave something for the next generation. So just continuing to do what we do as stewards of the land, but we need to prove that we're doing it well.
Mm-hmm. Pues estamos un poquito fuera de tiempo, pero...
Well, we're running a little bit low on time, but I have another question that I wanted to ask you. It's somewhere around here. Let me see. Francisco Martinez says, it's a question more for Carisha, actually, I think. Is it safe to consume meat from the United States? It's a very direct question, but I think it's quite easy to answer, is it not, Carisha or Cheyenne?
¿Consideras que es seguro para un...
Do you think it is safe for a Spanish consumer to consume US meat?
Do you want me to take that one, Carisha? Do you want to chime in? The US food safety system, like Europe, we have 2 of the top food safety systems in the world. So, when you see that USDA establishment seal on the box, our global customers really see that as a sign of safety and quality. In addition to what we have to do for Europe, as Carisha said, we have to follow the same requirements that domestic producers follow in Europe. So even though, the science has been very clear, recognized by international standard bodies like Codex, that the use of growth promotants is safe, but those are the rules to export to Europe. So all the beef and pork we send is growth, promote, and free, just like the beef and pork produced in Europe is. So we have very, very tight controls to make sure that we are producing EU compliant hogs and cattle. Those are produced in EU approved plants. That meat is segregated. Those carcasses are segregated at all times. From the time they arrive at the plant as live animals, they go into the cooler as carcasses. They're fabricated, first thing in the morning on their very own EU shift. They go into boxes that get that EU health mark. They go to EU approved cold storages. So the supply chain and the controls to meet the EU requirements are incredibly tight. And some of the toughest export requirements we have for the 80 plus countries we export to. So in addition to, our very, very robust food safety programs in the US, you can feel at ease that when Europe says we have to do these requirements to ship product to their consumers, we are doing it.
Como comentaba al principio, que tenemos mucho en común.
It's like I was saying at first, we have a lot in common, and food safety of the population is, I think, one of the things that we are most concerned about. We were saying that in the chat box as well. I'm going to just ask one more question. Jesus Serrano says, and I think perhaps this question would be more for Manuel. Do extensive beef farms have a competitive advantage in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Because you were talking about 1/3 of emissions coming from beef. And although that data doesn't seem to be quite accurate, but so is there a competitive advantage in extensive farming? Well, if we were to look at the data in the stocks, we could draw that conclusion, yes. But we have to really understand that these inventories, these stocks, really just measure enteric fermentation and emissions of nitrous oxide. They don't measure anything else. They don't measure what comes before in the value chain or what comes afterwards, and they don't measure carbon sequestration. So to answer the question, do extensive farms have a competitive advantage? Well, what I usually say is that we don't really have a massive difference between extensive and intensive farms here in Spain. What we have is a productive system where cows are usually grazing and where calves are born and they are with the mother cows up to about 4 or 6 months of age. And then they are taken to be fattened, as Cheyenne was mentioning earlier. It's a very similar model, really, between the two. So it's just this last fattening stage where sometimes they receive concentrates. So do cows have advantages in extensive farms? Well, yes, but they would have more difficulties in taking their products to market. So what we have to do, and ProVacuno and ASEPROVAC know this, is we have to work together in both models and make the models efficient. Each of these models will have a stronger link in their chains at a different point, but it's about controlling the whole overall process and making the system efficient. Because what the producer, or rather the industry, sells is beef, and that's what we need to make more sustainable in general. Great. Well, I now just want to ask you both a very clear question. It's the question that I like to ask at the end of my events. If you had to sum up in 1 or maximum 2 words the future of sustainability in meat production in Spain and in the US, what word or words would you use? Well, I know mine would be keep working. Well, that's a very good one. That's a very good one. Cheyenne? What words would you choose?
Technology, innovation, productivity. More with less, I guess, ultimately, to sum that up.
Sí, también son muy buenas, además las dos son complementarias.
These are very good as well, and actually they're complementary in this case, what you said and what Manuel said. Well, I'm afraid we're running 15 minutes behind schedule, but I think what we've said has been very interesting. Thank you so much, Manuel and Cheyenne, for your presentations, your explanations, for your answers to these questions. And thanks to everyone who is at the other side of this screen. Especially, I want to thank the US Embassy for its support in this event, because it's good to have this shared vision when you organize these things. And thank you for really making everything clear, for making sure that there are no lies, that everything is clear, that everything is transparent, because livestock production and meat production will thank us for it at both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you very much, and good evening or good day.